Today we're going to be talking about ATP and ADP. We've mentioned these briefly when we were talking about biochemistry. We talked about how these are high energy molecules and briefly mentioned them when we were talking about nucleic acids. But they are going to be very important when we're discussing our different types of cell energy processes, both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. These two work together kind of in tandem. It's going to be kind of a cycle. We're going to be using the energy that's coming from our ATP molecule, that is a high energy molecule, and then by using that, we're releasing a lower energy molecule like ADP that we can recharge using food that is eaten by the organism. When it comes to ATP, we need to know what the word ATP itself means, especially for the EOC. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and it itself is a high energy molecule. We're going to use it to transfer energy for the breakdown of food molecules to help us with different cellular metabolic processes that require energy. If you remember in cell transport, we were talking about how those active transport processes require some type of energy, and that's going to be our ATP molecule that we're referring to there. ATP itself is named after its structure. So the A part comes from the adenine, which is a nitrogenous base, if you remember that when we were talking about DNA and RNA. And then the sugar is a ribose sugar. It's the same sugar that you find in RNA. And then the T comes from the triphosphate. There are 3 phosphates. So tri meaning 3 means there are 3 phosphates. And that's going to be our major difference between the ATP and the ADP molecule is the number of phosphates. And that plays into the fact that one is going to possess more energy than the other. ATP is used constantly in the body for different cellular processes. We're going to see it being used to transfer energy for different biochemical reactions. And in order to receive that amount of energy that we're going to need, we're going to have to get that energy from the food that we eat. So ATP itself is consumed during these energy requiring processes like active transport processes. We see this with the protein pumps when that ATP bonds to the protein so that sodium and potassium can flood in and out of the cell. We see this when we're doing types of things like protein synthesis and DNA replication, which we'll discuss specifically in Unit 5. But a lot of these processes that require energy require a high amount of energy, and ATP is that molecule that we're going to use. In the process of the ATP molecule being used, we are left with a lower energy molecule known as ADP. And ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate. It's a lower energy molecule, still has energy because the energy that we find in these molecules is stored in the bonds. That should sound familiar. That came back from the Unit 1 when we were discussing biochemistry. All the energy is stored in the bonds of the molecules, and in order to get that energy, we have to break those bonds, therefore releasing it. ADP looks a lot like ATP. The only difference between the two is the fact that there are now only 2 phosphates in the ADP because we just broke one off in order to release that energy being used for cellular processes. Like I mentioned, it's a cycle. ATP and ADP are directly related to one another. We're using the ATP and then we're recharging the ADP. So energy is stored in the ATP's phosphate bonds. And the high energy phosphate bond is between the 2nd and 3rd phosphates. And that has to do with the stereochemistry of the molecule. So it has a certain shape that makes it a lot more capable of holding in energy in that bond as opposed to the 1st and 2nd phosphates that are there. And yes, we could break those first 2, but it's much more efficient for your body to use that 2nd and 3rd phosphate bond to be able to break that and use that instead. In order to recharge the ATP molecule, we're going to have some type of phosphate molecule, those freely floating phosphates that we're floating around in the cytoplasm. We're going to use food to attach those back to the ATP. So like I mentioned, it's a cycle. We're going to start with an ATP molecule, break the phosphate off, releasing energy. There's a phosphate freely floating that can reattach to an ADP that just wants a phosphate to bond to it so it can be used in the cellular energy process, therefore completing the cycle. ADP, like I said, is continually converted by adding that phosphate. ATP carries more energy than the ADP molecule, which is why your cellular energy processes do these things. And then on this slide, you're going to see that there are two quick summary sentences at the end where it shows us that ATP, when used, we're going to release that ADP. We're going to release that energy into the cell used for those processes like active transport and DNA synthesis and protein synthesis. And we're also going to release a free phosphate. But in order to recharge it, we're going to need some food consumed by that organism. We're going to need one of those phosphates and that ADP molecule. So we don't get rid of it, we just continue to recycle it over and over and over again.